Thomas is a tank engine. I mean, I think you could tell if you just look at him. And like most tank engines, Thomas has a driver. Or at least he had one. As a series, Thomas and Friends was very on and off about if they wanted to include drivers. At first, they were all over the series, but by the end of it, it's pretty easy to forget they're there. But then another question arises. Does Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends truly need drivers? Are there good stories without them? Are they always required to keep the world in check the way Audrey intended back in the Railway series? So I figured with this video, why not look at the way drivers have been used throughout the whole show's history, and talk about the pros of using drivers, the cons of using drivers, and episodes that work with and without drivers. So let's just get into it. In both the Railway series and the classic series of Thomas and Friends, the drivers of Thomas were just as important as the engines themselves. They put in their input, they were there to comfort their engines, scold them for whenever they did anything wrong, play tricks on them. They were basically just as much of a main character as Thomas or Percy were. And I think it added a unique level to the Thomas and Friends franchise that wasn't really explored as heavily in other media that focused on sentient vehicles. Either they didn't have drivers at all, or the drivers were completely subdued. But honestly, the Golden Age of Thomas always made sure the drivers were pretty important. They were always assisting, they were always fighting. Episode functionality wouldn't really have worked without them. An episode like Thomas Comes to Breakfast, for example, wouldn't have really worked if drivers weren't in that one, as Thomas thinks he can drive himself and has to learn the hard way he can't. Or at times, it could be something like Duncan Gets Spooked, where Duncan's driver, because he's sick of his crap, decides to play a trick on him, and honestly, something like that's really funny. Really thinking back on it, the earlier seasons got so much mileage out of using drivers and how they functioned in the series and the books. But as the TV show went on, I'm assuming because it seemed easier to write this way, drivers were slowly starting to phase out and pop in here and there, pretty much starting with Season 8. They weren't completely removed, that wouldn't come until the reboot, but throughout Seasons 8 to 24, drivers' prevalence in episodes was very subdued. Technically, this did begin with Thomas and the Magic Railroad, as the drivers were not really helpful for that story and plot, and well, it's Magic Railroad, so it's got its own weird logic, but the official TV show adopted this idea that the drivers could still be seen in the cabs, but they won't really interact with their engines much, if at all, or really contribute anything. And a lot of really weird scenes come out of it. For example, you have something like in Percy's New Whistle, where his driver literally scolds him for blowing his whistle too loud. And all I'm thinking is, aren't you the one who's controlling this? The 50-50 stuff really gets confusing after a while, especially because sometimes the engines are just like, man, I need to pick something up or grab this, and their driver just walks out and does it, even if it's like the dumbest idea ever. They're just not going to object. They're mindless drones to their engines. However, I don't want to say the lack of drivers was exclusively a bad thing. If anything, I think the Andrew Brenner era showed how many episodes could work without drivers. But I am getting ahead of myself. I really wanted to just make this a general overview on how drivers functioned and operated within Thomas throughout its whole history, up until All Engines Go, because I don't feel the need to talk about it. So now I wanted to talk about the advantages that come from both using and not using drivers, starting with... So to start off with things that drivers do add to Thomas stories, well, there's never a sense that any of the engines are alone, for example. They're always present, they're always able to have someone to talk to. It's really cool, and you can always have a back and forth between the engine and driver. It also makes certain episodes have higher stakes, because not only is it just the machine in danger, but there's also the people in danger as well. Take something like Toby in the flood, for instance. Like, it's not just Toby surviving that flood, it's his driver and fireman having to survive it as well. Or in an episode like A Better better view for Gordon, where we see his driver and fireman and even Sir Topham Hatt get harmed due to Gordon's crash. It makes it feel like there's a lot more weight when you realize it's not just the engine who's going to be feeling this pain, but actual people as well. Along with that too, you are given a lot of very creative limitations. Because, well, engines can't drive themselves, the engines can't fuel themselves, you got things to work around and what kind of conflicts and stories can be driven. Oh, maybe we want one where Thomas wants to drive himself, but, well, it turns out he can't. Or maybe we have one where Percy gets jealous of Harold and his driver's like, you know what, we're going to show up that helicopter, having the two work together to win a race against Harold and his crew. And having drivers also does a good job connecting it to its roots the most, because Thomas was meant to be a little more realistic and have all of its characters based off of real-life trains and real stories that happened on British railways, so why shouldn't drivers not be involved? Obviously they were in the real world, so they should be here too. Man, when I really think back about it, the series got so much mileage out of using drivers back then. They always felt like they were just as important as the steam engines themselves. They were able to tell a lot of stories between them and their engines, whether they sympathize with them, fight with them, or just have a good old laugh with them. Man, kind of miss those days. But I don't want to discredit stories that don't use drivers, because I don't think that's exclusively a bad thing. So let's get into what happens when you don't tell stories with drivers. So with all the praise that I just gave to telling stories with drivers, you would think, oh, there's no reason to ever tell a Thomas story that doesn't include drivers. But A, I'd be a massive hypocrite because I did a Thomas series, don't watch it, it's terrible, that didn't have drivers at all. And B, the TV show itself has told so many really good stories that wouldn't have benefited from drivers being in them. So let's talk about it. For starters, without drivers, the engines are all alone. And I know I praise them for having that kind of dual thing, which I think works really well, but also having solo adventures where the engines don't have anyone to talk to and feel isolated from the rest of Sodor can work really well as well. Decision-making on the engine side would also be altered, as, without drivers, conveying them on where to go, they get to make up their own minds, and it makes a lot more of their failures feel more like their fault than the driver being the one to do it themselves. And I feel like there's a lot more discussion that can go on between the engines directly without the drivers getting involved. It's like they also have their own side of the community outside of the human workforce that goes into Sodor daily. And there's also just the connection that can come from it in general. Take, for example, an episode like Not So Slow Coaches from season 18. This episode, in my eyes, really wouldn't work with driver interference because this is such a Thomas, Annie, and Clarabelle direct episode and the connection that they have. Or you have episode like Henry's Hero, which, for example, teetered on two characters being wrong, which, again, if their drivers were involved, this wouldn't really work with engines having to learn the right and wrong ways of work, and that there is no 100% either way. In general, I can see many instances of why drivers were not used as often during the CGI stuff. There was a lot of mileage on choosing to not use them. But then here comes the big question. Does Thomas really need drivers to operate, or do we not really need them? Well, I'm going to be straight up about this one. I think this is a case where we can have our cake and eat it too, because I think both story formats have a lot of mileage. Yes, there's a lot more grounded stories you can tell with drivers. Episodes like Edward's Exploit, Four Little Engines, Percy's Ghostly Trick, Toby and the Flood, I think are all episodes that represent the benefits of having drivers in a story with talking trains. However, then you get other episodes like Henry's Hero, Howdy James, and Not So Slow Coaches that in my eyes can show why maybe you wouldn't want to tell a story with drivers. So, in my opinion, if you got a story you want to tell in the Thomas universe, both options have a lot of merit, and if anything, the fact that it can be so diverse like this is really cool. So never feel afraid to not use drivers, or never feel afraid to go more real and use drivers. There's merit to both formats in this case, and I hope you all know that any stories that are going to be told before and after have merit, no matter if they do or don't use drivers. I mean, you can use both in bad ways, but for the most part, both have a lot of creative benefits that I don't really think that there should be a one definitive one here. In fact, I even did a poll on this on my community page, and it seems like most people agree with me, so that feels good. But tell me in the comments below what you guys think. Should Thomas depend on drivers? Should the show not use drivers? And give me some interesting reasons as to why. I'd love to hear it. Also, we are getting pretty close to 2,000 subs. I'm just saying, could we do it before the end of the year? Probably not, but I'd like to think so. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and take care. Bye.